that we're so concerned about these family members potentially coercing that decision. But yet we have no problem handing the decision entirely to those same family members in 30% of the cases. That is an indefensible position.
He had agency. It was huge for him, I'm going to go ahead and say it, an existential relief to know that he had options at the end of his life.
Welcome to the Medicine Science Podcast. I'm Cameron Abbasi, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ. In June 2025, the House of Commons in Westminster, UK, voted in favour of legalising assisted dying in England and Wales. MP, Member of Parliament, Kim Ledbetter proposed a private member's bill, as it is called, that would allow adults who are terminally ill and expected to die within 6 months to have medical help to end their own lives. Now, under scrutiny by the House of Lords, the peers have proposed over 1,000 amendments to ensure the bill is as safe and workable as possible in their view, and this reflects some lawmakers' opposition to the principle of assisted dying. Globally, over 300 million people already have access to this option. To discuss some of those concerns, we're joined today by experts from countries that have already legalised and implemented assisted dying services. We have with us James Downer from the University of Ottawa in Canada and Catherine Forrest from California. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
I also have with me Richard Hurley, one of my colleagues at the BMJ. Richard, before we get into that discussion, you've been keeping an eye on the legislation in the UK. Can you tell us what's going on in Parliament? It's quite a story, isn't it?
Thanks, Cameron. Well, this bill was introduced by the Labour MP Kim Ledbetter, and it's based on law that's been in effect in Oregon for nearly 30 years now. So the bill scraped through the Commons last summer with a majority of 23 votes. But because this is a private member's bill, and that means that an individual MP brought it to Parliament instead of the government, it's on a tight leash. If it doesn't clear all of its hurdles by the end of the parliamentary session in May, if time runs out, the bill could fail completely. Since autumn, the bill's been being scrutinised by the House of Lords, and this is where it's got rather bogged down. The Lords have tabled 1,277 amendments. And that's a record for any equivalent bill in the history of our Parliament. And just over half of these amendments have come from just 7 peers who object to assisted dying. So this has led to accusations of delaying tactics and filibustering, suggesting that these peers may be running down the clock deliberately to run this bill off of the road. So some of these amendments have been described as unworkable, repetitious, unnecessary, but others are reflecting serious and legitimate concerns. We're talking about things like how patients can be protected from coercion, how to identify victims of domestic abuse who are requesting assisted dying, broader impacts of the bill were it to become law on the disabled community, and whether it's wise to introduce assisted dying when we have such stretched palliative and social care systems. So elected MPs in the House of Commons have said that they want this legislation to be passed, reflecting the wishes of voters. But if the unelected Lords don't reach a vote in time, then there's talk of constitutional crisis. Some are suggesting dusting off the arcane Parliament Act, which could bypass the Lords altogether, bring the bill back to the Commons, but this is a nuclear option, which means that all the expertise of the Lords could be lost just to get this bill over the line.
So, as you said, there are many amendments, but also, I mean, whether you think some of them are spurious or not, there are a number that are genuine reflections of people's concerns. And I guess it's a bit like any issue. What you don't want is a dilution effect where the important issues are kind of diluted or drowned out by the absolute noise of so many kind of amendments, in this case, being thrown up. So what I'd like to do with James and Catherine is talk a little bit about the key issues that we think are the themes that we think have emerged, and get a sense of your experience as to how things have played out where you are, because you're in parts of the world where assisted dying is in law, and now you in fact have experience of that legal right being operationalized. So can I start with Catherine first? Catherine, tell us a little bit about generally what's the experience been since assisted dying was introduced in California?
Our bill in California was proposed nearly 20 years after Oregon's law, which is just north of us, and Washington's law. And I think one thing that's important to understand is that it came forward in California several times. It also came forward in Oregon and Washington several times for much the same reasons that's happening now in the House of Lords, which is people thinking about what they imagine the problems might be. And it passed through our process. We now have, over 10 years in our state and over a quarter century in the western states of the United States.
Okay, we'll get into some other key issues in a minute, but thank you for that. James, how about you?
So in Canada, assisted dying, or MAID as we call it, medical aid and medical assistance in dying, was actually legalized by action of court. So it was in Canada, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You can challenge laws and prohibitions and have sections of laws struck out if they don't correspond to what is called our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that was the mechanism by which assisted dying was legalized in Canada. And Parliament was sort of forced to pass a law then to fill this kind of this gap that the courts can't write law, but they can strike law down.
And it did strike down a particular law, the law being... So
Section 241 of our Criminal Code of Canada, for those who are taking notes, it's there's provisions of the law prohibiting people from furnishing somebody with the means to end their life or actually ending somebody's life who meet the following criteria. So the court outlined that if you met certain criteria, that this would not be considered aiding and abetting suicide or homicide under the law. And those provisions were largely transferred into the bill that the federal government then ultimately passed, our Bill C-14. Now, the challenge when you have laws done that way is, of course, that the courts usually will strike them down, but give a delay of 12 months or a certain amount of time to allow Parliament to pass a law. And as politicians sometimes do, they hum and haw and they drag their heels and they take their times. And sometimes when you don't spend the months and years necessary to develop all like educational materials and all the things that must go around a law, the initial period is a bit of a sort of a bit of a challenging period. And that certainly was the case in Canada, where we did not have standardized education, or oversight was different between the provinces, et cetera. We've sort of spent the first few years catching up. Now there is standardized education. There is more sort of standardized or consistent reporting and oversight across the country. But that would be sort of the one thing I think about the Canadian experience that was maybe not as good as it could have been, is because when you change a law in this way, you don't necessarily get the same time and the same participation of government and stakeholders to set up the infrastructure that you need to make an assisted dying system work.
Can we just go into some of these more specific issues that we're facing here, and perhaps that are being raised here, and that you might be able to tell us about your experience in terms of how you handle them? I mean, one of the big issues that is being talked about here is the question of coercion For example, victims of domestic abuse might apply or be coerced into applying for assisted dying. Was that a point of debate where you are, and how do you think that's been handled, and has it remained an issue? Catherine, first of all.
We went to great efforts to try and put in safeguards or things that helped us evaluate whether or not someone was being coerced. And I think that they've been quite successful. In the disability community, for instance, when actually surveyed, people that are on the disability in the disability community would want that option for themselves. So the question was not, should we have it for everyone, but how do we make sure that we're protecting those that are vulnerable? The example you gave, domestic violence, well, someone who's in a domestic violence situation would never qualify. We only apply it for people that have a terminal diagnosis identified by 2 independent physicians, and with a wait period. We're required to consult with them privately without others there, and also in the language that they speak as their first language with interpretation. So there have been no cases in any of the states of the U.S. Now, fully a quarter of our population is under such law, and we're a large country. And there are very, very vocal disability opponents to it, that it's really based on a different issue, which is, do people with disabilities or living with disabilities have sufficient support? And it's a different question, because the answer is, of course, they should, and attention could be directed, evidently, could be directed there as well. But it's similar, in my opinion, it's very similar, like situations like access to anesthesia during labor, for instance. If you live in a rural area, you might not have access because there aren't enough anesthesiologists present in the rural hospitals. But does that mean that people that live in urban areas should not have access to something to ease their suffering? And it's not up to the physician to decide what suffering is. It's up to the person themselves what suffering is during that time period. When we apply those very same principles that we use in medicine and in society around individual rights and the availability in a world that has scarcity, most people opt towards just making sure we have sufficient safeguards. And our experience, and the experience of Oregon, Washington, and now Colorado, a number of states, I think we're at 12 jurisdictions as of the last count, have not had any problems in that regard. No case courts and no concerns. I think one of the things I would acknowledge here is that it takes a lot of courage for people to change their minds. It takes a lot of courage. I personally changed my mind as society moved, and I rethought the circumstances of our practice. So I really have a deep respect for the process of considering these deep concerns about our vulnerable populations, and the evidence doesn't support it. What it does suggest is that our insecurities about vulnerability are real and present across our country, Canada, those considering it in these times.
Okay, so one of the safeguards you described there is clinicians making an assessment as to whether the request is appropriate or not, which would presumably deal with an instance of somebody who's a victim of domestic abuse. But what if the victim of domestic abuse also has a prognosis, which in the UK setting, for example, would mean that they don't have longer than 6 months to live? If you have a prognosis like that and you're being coerced, is there any experience with handling that situation?
A couple of things here. One is that the person who's making the decision is the person, not their partner or anyone who's should they be abusive. They're a person that has a terminal disease. They are going to die. They are a dying person. And should they have less rights to have that kind of autonomy at the end of their lives, we should just make sure that they have the opportunity. We see the coercion the other way all the time. People cannot let go of their dying families. What does our society actually do at the end of life? And the forces are towards the prolongation of death or the extension of life, if you will, for some. And that's where the true barriers. I think thinking of in those terms is important. Whether or not someone is a victim of domestic abuse and whether or not our reporting and our access to help is available is important, but it's not a part of this conversation.
Okay, thank you. James, what's the experience in Canada?
Again, I think everybody when there's discussion about legalizing assisted dying, the number one question is, how do we prevent coercion? So what I can tell you is the processes to assess somebody for capacity and the decision for an assisted death are far more robust than anything we do in medicine. So these duplicate independent assessments, including asking family members to leave the room, this is pretty much the only thing we ever do that for in all of medicine. One of the things that I find very puzzling about listening to the debate in the UK and on social media is there's this sort of implication that there's these magical tests that social workers possess, or like detector abilities or tricorders or whatever, that we can just detect coercion in others. We can't. But we have a process by which we go through, to try to establish, voluntary decision making in everybody, and we're following it to the nth degree in assisted dying. Now, the final point I'll make on that is because I'm a palliative care doctor. I also do intensive care. So what we know is that for about 30% or more of the population, this is American data, but it pans out in other societies as well, that about 30% of adults, before you die, you will be in a situation where a life and death decision, has to be made on your behalf by a next of kin, right? So, and that is, substitute decision making is well enshrined in Canadian law, in U.S. law, and as it is in British law. And so 30% of people are having decisions made on their behalf completely by family members with absolutely no oversight whatsoever. So what I don't understand is why, and we think that that's important. We think it's important to give patients a voice that comes through family members. So I don't understand how you could be comfortable with that. Like, how can we be so concerned about the potential for coercion of an autonomous speaking individual who we can assess, and that we're so concerned about these family members potentially coercing that decision, but yet we have no problem handing the decision entirely to those same family members in 30% of the cases. That is an indefensible position. We understand that that's not something you can ever fully exclude, but I would say that the stories of this happening, we just have never seen a credible story of this actually taking place.
Okay, that's interesting to hear. Catherine introduced the issue of disability. In your experience, James, are there additional risks for people who are disabled?
People with disabilities are, considered a vulnerable demographic, right? So the people who are vulnerable, we have to complete the sentence. Vulnerable to what? You're vulnerable to getting something that you don't want, or you're vulnerable to not getting something that you do want. You have decreased agency to act in your interests and wishes. I want to draw a really strong contrast between when you actually talk to people with disabilities and what you hear from advocacy groups, because this is an area where there is a really sharp divide. Every study that has ever been done in multiple jurisdictions about assisted dying has shown very clearly that people with disabilities feel exactly the same way about assisted dying as people without disabilities. You have a spectrum of opinion, but the overwhelming majority do support the right to ask for an assisted death, right? So, what's happening is you see advocacy groups that are claiming to be acting on specific concerns, but these are not borne out by their constituents, right? So I think these are individuals who understand that, yes, they would know better than anybody that what they're at risk of and what they're not getting, and the frustrations they encounter in interacting with the healthcare system. And there are many of them, and they know perfectly well that their health suffers as a result, and that they have socioeconomic deprivation as a result. And knowing all of that, they still strongly support that they would want this. That again, just to be very clear, although there is the potential for coercion and to be treated or to be treated poorly, what I think they recognize is that there is nothing more coercive than a blanket ban on access to something, right? Like that's coercion too. And as Catherine's pointing out here, I've seen coercion 1,000 times, and literally every time it's family members trying to block the procedure of a competent person through various means of begging and asking. And again, like, I'm not suggesting that these are malicious attempts. They're emotionally having struggles with this. But everything up and including physical threats to the practitioners, the physicians involved in their care, legal threats, all sorts of media attention, all aimed at trying to intimidate the providers into not participating or get their family members to change their minds.
Okay. James, you mentioned that you work in palliative care, and that's, again, one of the issues that's being debated here. In particular, there's a question around the provision of palliative care in certain parts of the country and whether you can get adequate palliative care. And as you can imagine, the argument is that then that might lead to people seeking an assisted death when, in fact, what they need is a better provision of palliative care. Is that something you come across, and how do you mitigate?
So the number, again,
that?
we have pretty good numbers on this. If you look at the demographics and you look at the palliative care provision among MAID recipients, and this is around the world, we have data from Oregon, Washington, Canada, that the people receiving assisted death have extremely high rates of palliative care involvement, way higher than you see in the general population. In Canada, it's sort of 75 to 80% across the board. But and then in the UK, in the US, hospice enrollment 90+%. Far better than the population average. In Canada, we go a step further. In our federal reports, the assessors are asked, if they did not get palliative care, why not? Did you feel that they could have benefited from it? Yes and no. Did they have access to it but refused it? Because often patients will simply say they just don't want to see anybody. And again, it speaks to another key point, which is that, generally speaking, the rationale for which people are requesting an assisted death is overwhelmingly what one might call existential distress. It's not a type of distress for which we actually have very effective interventions at the moment. So it's not that people are getting this idea that palliative care is somehow the opposite of MAID or the antidote to MAID. Quite the contrary. It's almost invariably provided prior to MAID. These are the people getting the best palliative care in the system. If our population, if Canada's demographics, if we had that kind of palliative care provision in our whole population that the MAID recipients get, we would be the envy of the world.
I would like to add something to that, which is that we have found, because our law includes having to discuss the options available, that two things have happened. One is many more people have entered hospice than might have. So that's an important thing. It's not a small proportion. It's a large proportion that didn't know that they could make decisions for themselves, making decisions about how they want to live their life in the life that they have. And secondarily, we saw a huge burst in education for our family physicians, you call them general practitioners, on palliative care and hospice care. And the result has been that some of that is not in specialists, is not in the palliative care specialty, which is actually not many decades in existence, but has been perfected there. And a very tight correlation and consultation between those that's their specialty and those that are in the field in practice. So I think understanding that that's a malleable system that can improve is really, really important here. And the last thing I would say is that we know that when people know what their options are, and including aid in dying or assisted death, most do not use it. It is the comfort to them that they have options for what to do if they're in the suffering as they define it for themselves is immeasurable. Everyone comments on it, how important it is, and in my own case, and I'll probably cry here, my husband used aid in dying in 2021. He had a terminal disease. I would have done anything to have him. He had terrific palliative care. But when he found out about his terminal diagnosis, and he knew that if it got to that, to a level of suffering that he could, he had agency. It was huge for him, I'm going to go ahead and say it, an existential relief to know that he had options at the end of his life. And We see that all the time. I've seen that for a decade now in my own state, that people just want to know that it's there.
If I can just chime in on that as well, because the other palliative care point that people often raise is a concern that this will become the cheap alternative to palliative care, that palliative care funding suffers, and people are doing various mental gymnastics to try to pretend that a rising number is actually a falling number. I can tell you that the data from around the world is quite clear that hasn't happened. But in Canada, and certainly at the part of the province country where I work here in Ottawa, we have had a staggering and absolutely unprecedented investment in palliative care here. My division, I'm the head of a division. It was when I got here, 8-9 years ago, it was 21 physicians. It's now going to be 47, 48 this year, probably rising to 50. The number of hospice beds in our province has more than doubled since 2016. These are unprecedented increases, and our national sort of reporting system, our information gathering and reporting sort of system, identified that there's also been a very strong surge in the use of palliative care at or near the end of life. So the idea that there's this sort of one is the antidote to the other, one is the opposite of the other, it's a false dichotomy. People want it's both and people want this. But fundamentally, if you're concerned about gaps in your palliative care system, the idea that you can fix those by restricting rights or somehow encourage stakeholders to fix those by restricting rights, I think is also a bit misguided, right? Again, if the only way to fix palliative care is to fix palliative care, right? The only way to improve your social supports is to improve your social supports. If your idea is that we desperately need to not give these people an alternative so that they, if you believe that there are suffering as a result of this and seeking this out, the idea that you would then force these people, hold them hostage effectively, to try to compel government to make better policy decisions, I think that's more than a bit misguided.
I would agree. I would agree with you wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Understood. You both mentioned staff and health professionals, and there are a number of questions in relation to this. For example, one of the points people are making is whether or not health professionals should initiate conversations about assisted dying. Is that appropriate? What if a health professional has a conscientious objection to assisted dying? What should happen in that instance if they're having to look after somebody who is seeking that option? And then, of course, there's the issue of how integrated assisted dying should be with the health service itself. So in the UK, as you know, we have a National Health Service, which provides universal health coverage, but also with end-of-life care services. And I guess from what you've described, James, if I could start with you, the very last of those points, that is something what you're managing on a day-to-day basis.
That's correct. Right? So about something like just 10% of all assisted dying takes place in a palliative care bed in Canada now, and about 20% of providers, made providers, I believe, are palliative care providers effectively. So we definitely have a fair proportion who do that. And again, putting these things together. The idea of creating a separate service, I think, is mulled about in many jurisdictions, but ultimately discarded. The idea is, I think one of the biggest fears, as we've outlined, is that somebody's going to seek out assisted dying because of perception that they don't have any alternatives. If you're really genuinely concerned about that, and you feel like palliative care can and should be meeting the needs of people asking for MAID, why you would want to keep those two at a distance from one another makes absolutely no sense at all. What you would want to do is actually keep these people in the system, surrounded by those alternatives right up until the last minute. Why would you want anything else? It is certainly not necessary also for the protection, I think, of conscience rights to to sort of outsource it to a completely separate service. Again, I think, everybody has the right of conscientious objection not to participate in MAID or do an assessment. There are sometimes professional obligations that if you receive a request, what you are obligated to do in terms of passing that request on to somebody who can then take it from there. And again, those have been tested in court, and we have policies.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a couple of more questions for you, which I'd like to come to in a minute. But Rich, did you want to make any comments or ask any additional points about what we've discussed so far.
One question for you, James. The absence of evidence of harms isn't evidence of absence. Isn't a single case of unidentified coercion or domestic abuse one too many?
Well, I think that, I understand that we need to be really vigilant about trying to prevent any exceptional cases. What is a mistake is to assume, if your standard for action is in advance proof that with 100% confidence that nothing could ever be misused in any way at all, if literally every objection must be overcome first, then we could literally do nothing in this world. That is, I think it is really important to be adults about this and understand that in every aspect of healthcare, and I'm going to talk about everything in the world. We have ample evidence that all sorts of things are being grossly misused on a massive scale. The scandal of the Liverpool care pathway in the UK, and need I mention, our response to that was thoughtful. Your response to that, I should say, was thoughtful and inquisitive. Nobody decided to do away with morphine in palliative care because morphine in palliative care, we felt, got misused. The idea that in the U.S. For-profit hospice has come under the spotlight recently as having been misused and leading to premature deaths. We still have for-profit hospice. When you look at the misuse of opioids, for example, prescribed opioids in Canada, 8,000 people are dying approximately every year from opioid use disorder and from overdoses of opioids. 20% of those opioids are prescribed diverted opioids. So that's, quick math, that's about 1,500, 1,600 deaths a year from prescribed opioids. Are we banning opioids? You have to start to understand that you cannot have the expectation that everybody must prove that something can never happen in order to be considered safe enough to use. That's not appropriate. We do not hold anything in medicine and end-of-life care to that standard. I'm sorry to say it's a bit absurd.
You spoke about the oversight, and you gave us some information about that. Anything more you'd like to say about the oversight mechanisms?
I would say you have a very interesting situation in Canada because every province has a slightly different oversight mechanism. You have oversight in the sense of making sure that people are meeting professional standards, and then you have oversight in terms of collecting data about who's getting made and why, the sort of demographics and the number counts, etc. I think what we're increasingly seeing is a pivot towards what we're calling sort of coal-face regulation, where you start to get resources and sort of working groups to be available to providers who are genuinely unclear about what they're, whether this person should be or should not be eligible, and what standards they should observe, like what are reasonable alternatives they should be offering for somebody with a condition that's quite rare or unusual, but is clearly causing suffering, and we don't think it's curable. Those are the situations where you see things going, and I think I like the idea of, for exceptional and complicated cases, the idea that you might have a bit more of a robust upstream pre-procedural oversight, which is not going to be necessary for the large majority of cases.
Thank you. Catherine, how does oversight work in California?
I think that it's been important to understand that we don't regulate other aspects of medicine by our government. The standards of care are born, and rightly so, because it's a changing field, by our professional organizations and held by our board review for practices that are unacceptable or not to standard of care. So our oversight does not look like, are you doing the right medications, the precise way that we ask anything or do anything with our patients. And we do have mechanisms for if someone is unethical in their practice or incompetent or in their practice, that they should be held responsible. It's really important, as James noted, to make sure that people have access to all the services that they need. But it doesn't mean that you withhold services, crucial services, to tend to suffering. Remember, we're talking about suffering right now. at the end of life.
Well, actually, that's an interesting. Can I just ask about that? Because that's an interesting point. And because here, yes, obviously suffering is a factor, but the people who can then be eligible for an assisted death are those with a terminal illness where the prognosis is that they will die within 6 months. Now, I think all of us on this call can probably understand that prognosis is you can make with reasonable certainty over the next few days or the next week, but once you get into months, it becomes quite a difficult prognosis to make. And there, obviously, some people do argue that the criterion should be suffering rather than this prognosis. Catherine, is that prognosis a criterion in California?
Yes, it is. Prognosis of
it is as well.
6 months or less to dying. And I would say that the force to live is tremendous. In hospice, if we get someone who outlives their prognosis of 6 months, people celebrate. It's like will to live cannot be underestimated. I mean, overestimated. It's huge factor in what we're talking about here. So the question becomes, well, what if they were going to live for more than 6 months? Were we missing those people? And I think that, again, you're weighing a little bit agency. Who gets to decide if they take the risk that they might be shortening their life with their actions than others would think is acceptable?
Okay, James.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. Let's be very clear, right? Like I think certain jurisdictions have chosen to include a prognostic criterion, and others have not. I'll make it easy for you. When it turns out that it doesn't actually have a very dramatic effect on who gets assisted dying in the end, because the part that is missed in this entire debate, frankly, is the biggest factor determining whether somebody does or does not get made is the patient. This notion that patients are these sort of dust particles being blown about by external forces, or you're trying to decide how much you want to open the valve, and that's what determines who gets made and why, is a fantasy. You see the number one factor determining who gets made is far more than anything else is disease. People with ALS, about 25 to 50% of people with ALS get assisted dying, who die of ALS are dying with assisted dying. With cancer, it's about 8 to 10%. And with all the other non-cancer illnesses, it's more like 1 to 2%. So you're seeing factors of 4 and 5-fold differences just because of the disease that they have. And so, whether you decide that it should be 6 months, 12 months, or unlimited actually has very little to do with the fact that most people are requesting assisted death when they are probably within weeks of death or only short months. So well past this sort of 6 month point. And you're right. I mean, prognosis is not accurate at all. We are often inaccurate when we get out to 6 months and more. But we still allocate all sorts of resources on that basis because you have to make a judgment, right? At the end of the day, if there was a better way to do it, we do it in deciding who's approaching the end of life. But the question of how much is kind of a moot point in many ways. The whole point of this is you're saying if somebody has what you consider to be essentially an incurable condition with suffering that cannot be relieved by any means that this person finds acceptable, and they are choosing to forego the remainder of their natural life, however long that might be, in the interest of optimizing quality of life. I don't know why that would be grossly a different calculation for us as a society, whether they have 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months to live. It doesn't make a big difference in who gets made, and I just don't really feel that it makes a big difference ethically either.
Okay, thank you. I've got 2 quick questions for both of you. We start with you, James. If there's one law you could change in Canada in relation to MAID, what would that be?
What I find most impressive is the amount of data and the ability that we have now to collect a great deal of data about end-of-life care for people who have received MAID. We know a lot about that now, way more than we know for everybody else. To my mind, this should be the model by which we start to evaluate end-of-life care for everyone in our country. And this becomes the template for use for people regardless of whether they get MAID or not. That we understand what kind of care they got, how good it was, what services they had access to, did they have and where problems, because we need to have a better idea of where those gaps are. I think the idea that we would only be concerned about socioeconomic status or service gaps for people who get MAID is, I think, morally indefensible. I think we know the horrible health impacts of all of these effects on people who die naturally, and we need to get about fixing them, not just pretending that this has anything to do with MAID policy.
Thank you. Catherine, what about in California?
I agree completely with James that it's inexcusable to keep the standard, to consider these standards when that's not the actual underlying issue. We did make a crucial change in California because we found that 1/3 of the people that had requested aid in dying in our 15-day waiting period died. And the reason that they died was because they didn't have access. And so that was an important shift, and we went to 48 hours. I think if I could make one change in our...
So just to be clear, when you say they didn't have access to what?
Because they had to wait to get their medication for assisted death. So they'd been approved for it. Okay. They'd gone through the whole process. There was a 15-day waiting period until they could receive it. And it turns out, as James aptly pointed out before, really most people die within days to a week of hospice, and that's also true for aid in dying. If I could make so shortening that is really crucial. I think what people don't understand is that people have thought about this for a long time before they come to us. They've been fighting cancer. They got the ALS diagnosis how many years ago? It's a rare person that was like, oh, I think I'll do aid in dying, and then they've thought about it, and it's internalized, and they're content in their decision. And our job is to assess the capacity to make that decision and then to enact it. But it's a falsehood to think that people have not already decided by the time they came. So waiting periods are absolutely indefensible, in my opinion. Even 48 hours just seems excessive. Having two people, I believe that is one of the important safeguards. I consider that an important safeguard, and others in my community do as well. If I were to make one change per se in our legislation, it would be alongside this. Again, as James pointed out, there's all kinds of things that happen in the death and dying community that we have no information about or access, for instance, to palliative care. The access to palliative care and the people that have aid in dying should equal everyone. Everyone should have access. And it doesn't necessarily need to be done by specialists if that's not possible, but education does. So if I could make one change in the laws, I would do it alongside as just a end-of-life care policy, which would look at all kinds of things. Do we have proper access and effective access to all the support systems and to education and to training for everyone? And we're all going to die. It's the one thing that we can say. All of us are going to die, and everyone should have access to the same kinds of support at the end of their death. And the issue is not really this people terminal diagnosis just with aid. It's for assisted death. It's everybody.
Okay, thank you. Right, final question, and I'm grateful for the time you've given us today. If there's a message you'd give to the members of the House of Lords in the UK who are debating this bill, and we hope at some point will vote on this bill, what would that be, Catherine?
My statement to the House of Lords would be, I understand that it's hard to change one's mind, but take a hard look and look why you are holding tight to the objections when international data absolutely has addressed every one of the issues that came forward in the House of Commons Select Committee or in the Scottish White Paper or in Canada's study. This is an area that, as James pointed out, is really well understood, better than many things that we do, and to take a step back and do the right thing.
James?
I would just say that, I think it's very legitimate for people to have, for personal, religious, moral, or even non-religious reasons, to be opposed to assisted dying. And I have a number of friends who are opposed to it. No problem with people who are opposed to assisted dying, and you can own that. I think if you're willing to stand up and take a position that you can defend on a basis, then do it. I think if you're using procedural, I'll use the word trickery, but if you're using deliberately cynical procedural efforts to try to stymie something that clearly people are asking for, and that for which there isn't a data-driven purpose, or using these sort of elliptical arguments around coercion or whatever else, I think you are going to expect to see a lot of very, very, very angry people respond to that, and I think that you will have earned their anger by doing so. I think you have to respect that in doing this, you are not addressing their needs in any way. If your concerns are about palliative care or social distress or other things, you are politicians. You are among the most powerful people in your country. If you have those concerns, address them. Right? Don't try to take this out by pretending that you're addressing any of these issues through obstructing a bill. I think that is the most cynical behavior, and I think it's very hard to have respect for it.
Thank you. We've had the carrot and the stick in terms of advice for the House of Lords. Thank you for your time today. You can find more coverage of assisted dying on bmj.com. In particular, we have articles from members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords online now. See you next time.